start recording. Okay. All right. So remember that we left off last week. We were talking about something called firing frequency, and we were talking about the force frequency relationship. Okay. And so the lead into all of this is the idea that because the nervous system signals with action potentials, that what we're going to get is this all or none type of firing. Okay. So once you generate an action potential, we can't have like a little bit of an action potential or a lot of an action potential. It's just you're getting it or you're not. Okay. It's a very analog kind of signaling thing. It's either on or it's not. And so one of the ways that the nervous system can modulate force production, or it also does this for any other kinds of signaling in the nervous system as well, is that it will alter the number of action potentials that it's sending in a given period of time. Okay, so if we imagine here, right, in the graph that I've put up now, that this is the same kind of period of time, and as we increase the amount of force, we are measuring action potentials coming from one motor unit. And so it has this, the nervous system has the ability to send them where there's more space in between action potentials or very little space in between action potentials. Okay, so I should tell you that the way that the data on this graph, and this is going to become important because in my very favorite graph it's collected in the same way, the way that we get this information is, this is probably, although I don't have it off the top of my head here, this is probably from sticking these little tiny needle, what are called EMG, so it's an electromyograph or electromyogram, but it's these little tiny needles. They look like if you were to like cut a piece of like wire that goes to your cell phone charger and unravel all the little wires that are wound together. It's, you take a needle, you feed one of those little fine wires into it, and then you jam them into the muscle. Okay, it's called fine wire or thin wire or whatever, needle EMG. And so you stick them in there and you move them around and you situate the wire in there such that it is very likely recording electricity from an axon that is going to one motor unit. Okay, and then you ask the person, and we do this very often in the little bitty small muscles in the hand, particularly in, and I don't know how I'll do it this way, in this muscle right here, which is called the FDI or the flexor digitorum something, FDI, flexor digitorum intermedius, I don't know, whatever in the hell it is. You guys know that I don't know anatomy, but it's the muscle that you use to move your finger up and down like this. Okay, and so you put them in there and you have the person try to push with their finger, like take your index finger and push it out. And you do that against at these increasingly high levels of force, and you measure the individual number of action potentials from this one particular motor unit. Okay, so this is what we would call an invasive technique. I've never had this done to me. I have a buddy at the University of Mississippi that's what he did in his postdoc, was they did these fine wire EMGs on people, and he said it's not particularly painful. If you've ever had acupuncture done, it's a lot like, kind of feels like having acupuncture done, but we can get this information from one kind of very single motor unit. Okay, and so what we know is once a motor unit is on, it can generate a little bit of force by having a very low firing frequency, say 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 action potentials in a second, or it can have a much higher firing rate, okay, somewhere in the 50, 60, 70, 100 hertz or 100 action potentials per second. And at some point, you're going to get this increase in force production from the idea of summation, where as the number of action potentials increases, the amount of calcium being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum goes up to some point. And at some point, no matter how many more action potentials we send, you're not going to get any more force. And so force kind of levels off. Okay, where that happens, kind of the firing frequency at which force will level off and plateau. So where this occurs up here, where the flat part of this curve is going to occur, is very much going to be dependent upon fiber type, okay? Slow twitch muscle fibers, which are going to be connected to slower twitch motor neurons, are going to reach their plateau in force at a lower firing frequency than those that are fast twitch fibers, okay? So does anybody want to wager a guess as to why that's the case?
Is it because they're smaller?
That's a really good guess, Ryan. It could be because they're smaller. That's not exactly what it is, but that's a really, they do tend to be smaller, and that is a good guess. Do you guys remember what it was that led to the summation and kind of what's going on with the calcium? Or do you remember something else that was different between fast and slow muscle fibers that might relate to calcium?
The circa is different.
That's right, Callie. The circa is different. And do you remember how it's different?
I think it's slower in taking up the calcium, right? So it can stay in the cell longer.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And so in a slow twitch fiber, the circa is slower, okay? So more calcium is going to stay around for a longer period of time. So at any given firing rate, there's going to be more calcium as it relates to its peak amount that is out in a cell in a slow twitch fiber. And so what that means is that we don't have to send as many action potentials to a slow twitch fiber to get all of the calcium out, because the circuit doesn't work nearly as fast as it does, okay? So what we will tend to see is that a lot of times in slow twitch fibers is that you may see a plateau in force somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 hertz, whereas in fast twitch fibers, it may be 40, 50, 60, 80 hertz in that way, okay? So these are things that are really hard for us to measure in intact. We can take a biopsy and we can measure it in intact human fibers, but it's really hard without doing a biopsy or without being invasive in some way for us to be able to know this. But one of the things that we can do in people, and again, we can do this in my lab, we could potentially do this in Dr. Pereira's lab or Dr. Mike's lab, is we can put stimulation electrodes on the surface of your muscles. And because I'm wearing shorts, we're going to do this, and I apologize in advance that I have very pasty white thighs, and nobody probably wants to see my old man thighs. But let me see if I can turn this thing down. Okay, but here we are, right? I'm ready to be somebody on campus now. With, it seems like a lot of the girls of late are wearing the shorts where they're so short that your shirt hangs past them, which is kind of weird. But so you put a stimulation electrode right here on the medialis, okay, and one out here on the vastus lateralis along these lines, and then we run an electrical current into your muscle, and we can control the frequency of action potentials going into your muscle. And so what happens when we do that is we're going to turn on a kind of random collection of fibers from your muscle. And so we guess that those random fibers are going to be somewhat reflective of your overall fiber type. So if you're a 50-50 person, when we stim you, we're probably going to get 50-50, okay? Or if you're 70% slow and 30% fast, then we're probably going to get 70% slow. So we can do this, and we can build this a curve in a person from doing surface stim. And then we could compare Ryan's curve to Alex's curve to Megan's curve and make some judgments again on who probably has more or less slow twitch or fast twitch fibers by building this curve, and then that's called a force frequency relationship. Okay, and so again, with a lot of this will change. This force frequency relationship changes when you get fatigued, because kind of the calcium stuff changes. It changes differently when you fatigue in people that have more slow twitch fibers and have more fast twitch fibers and those kinds of things. okay? But again, I like to just bring this stuff up because especially for our students, these are things that you may be interested in kind of looking at as part of a thesis project or something, and multiple of our labs have the capability to make some of these kinds of measures and kind of get at some stuff, okay? All right, here it is right now. Everybody pay proper tribute, okay? This is my single favorite graph in all of exercise physiology, okay? Mostly because I think it does a really, really, really outstanding job of visualizing and showing how we can use both sort of recruitment and changes in recruitment as well as changes in firing rate within the motor neurons that have been recruited to modulate or alter force production within a given muscle, okay? So this graph, I think, does the best job of showing how the nervous system works in an effort to control force production. It also, I think, is pretty cool that the first author on this paper, the person's last name was Monster, and so we just get to refer to it as the monster graph. And I feel like that should be worth something. When you have a really kind of bland last name like Black, you're always like, yeah, that's pretty freaking cool. All right, so let me explain the graph here, okay? So what you can see here on the x-axis is this is voluntary force production. So again, this is in the FDI muscle. So we've got a person that is pressing with their index finger against something and generating increasing amounts of force. What they have done is then they've jammed, a 40 or 50 different little fine wire needles into that muscle to try to isolate individual motor units out of each one of those things, okay? And so each line on here represents one motor unit. So when a line appears, that is going to mean that that motor unit has been recruited, that motor unit has been turned on. And then within the line, the way the line goes up in its sort of shape as it goes up and it bends, that is going to denote the y-axis is denoting firing frequency. So let me show you an example here. So this line right here, this represents one motor unit. And so you can tell then at some small amount of force production, that muscle is going to recruit and turn on one motor unit, okay? As you begin to increase force production, you do not immediately recruit a second motor unit. The first thing that happens is within the motor unit that's already on, is we begin to send a greater number of action potentials in a period of time, and we're going to ramp up the firing rate in that motor unit, okay? And so that's going to continue until we reach some force level, okay? At some amount of force, then the decision is made, now we're going to leave this motor unit at whatever its firing rate is, but now we're going to recruit a second motor unit. So now we have two motor units that are on, but each of them is firing at a different rate, okay? The one that was recruited initially is firing at about 15 or 16 hertz, and then the second one that was recruited when it is on is going at about 8 hertz, okay? So one is on, it's at a higher rate, and then we recruit a second one, but it starts off at a lower rate. And then we begin to do the exact same thing in both of them, where we're going to continue to crank up the firing rate in the first one. We're going to then start cranking up the firing rate in the second one until we reach some amount of force that we then recruit a third motor unit, and then a fourth and a fifth and so on. And so what is happening is, as this proceeds, you turn on a motor unit, it's at some low firing rate. Initially, we want to then increase the firing rate in that motor unit. And then when we get to some kind of increased force level, then that motor unit stays where it is, and we turn on a second one at a lower level. And then we increase both of them, and then we do a third, and it's also going to be lower. And so what you can see then is that as we move into an increasing amount of force, we start recruiting more and more motor units, and we start cranking up the firing rate in the existing motor units that are already on. And you will note that there is some kind of top end firing rate in most of these motor units, somewhere maybe 18 to 20 hertz, okay? And so as you need more and more force, you just turn on some of them. As we get out here, you've got some that have just been turned on while a bunch of other ones have been on for a while and they've already maxed out their firing rates. And so by doing things in this manner, the nervous system can recruit the fewest number of motor units possible to get a given amount of force, and also have whichever ones are on at the lowest possible firing rate, okay? So the more motor units that are on and the higher the firing rate, the more the energy cost is going to be. The more the energy cost is, the greater the chance that we're going to get fatigue. And for most kinds of things, getting fatigue is bad. And so the nervous system wants to turn on just the bare minimum of motor units at just the bare minimum of firing rate to kind of produce whatever force we want, okay? But hopefully from all of this, you guys can see the immense complexity that we are able to generate simply by the size and the frequency of the electrical signal coming from the brain down the spinal cord. And it allows us to generate these very, very precise amounts of force, which allow us to produce these very, very fine and coordinated movements, okay? Does that make sense, guys? Kind of, sort of, maybe, we think, we don't know. Keldon, I can't see your smiling face here, nor can I see Jacob's. I'm switching down here. Y'all are with me? We're okay? Okay, Jacob is good. All right. All right. So now you've seen my favorite graph. So every time you move, every time you write something, every time you do anything, this is what is happening in your muscles, okay? That's what's happening. Now, I don't think I have, nope, I don't have a picture of it here. We talk about it a little bit later on in class. So what you see, this pattern of recruitment and pattern of changes in firing frequency, to get at this in the best way, we have to use these fine wire EMGs, these indwelling EMG, these needle EMGs. I have one, and then there's also one over that is in Dr. Pereira's lab now that was Dr. Beck's. We have, most of the way that we measure electricity in your muscles is by slapping electrodes on them and measuring signal coming on the surface. If any of you guys have ever seen, like as an undergrad, if you put on like an EKG and you measured the electricity in the heart, we can do the same thing by putting electrodes over your muscles. But what we get when we do the muscle one is you're just getting kind of the net signal from everything under those electrodes. I actually have in my lab, and I said Dr. Pereira has them, we have some specialized electrodes that we can put on that allow us through some very complicated math and algorithms to try to generate something that looks like this out of a surface EMG signal. And it's not nearly as accurate as what this thing is, and you can only use it during certain kinds of contractions and under these very, very tight constraints. And so we've only done a couple of studies with it from my lab, but we have the capability. It's pretty cool, but it's also like the world's largest pain in the ass thing to be able to use. It makes the thing, Alex and Jacob, it makes y'all's trying to get your software and things for doing some of the blood flow stuff and the cerebral Doppler stuff look like it runs like a dream all the time with everything else. So anyway, okay. All right, that's the nervous system, okay? Now we got to move into a couple of other things that are going to contribute to force production, okay? So we have muscle size, right? Then we have our ability to turn on whatever muscle we have. We've already talked about the architecture of the muscles with like its pennation and things and how that plays a role in some ways controlling size and how many like sarcomeres we're going to get. Now we're going to talk about a couple of other more mechanical related things. And so what's happening is you have the muscle, right? It exists at some pronation angle. So you can have a certain number of cross bridges in there. We use the nervous system to turn those cross bridges on, some amount on at some firing rate. But now we have some other things that are happening inside the sarcomere potentially, and then other things that are going on with velocity and some biomechanical issues that are all going to get laid over that are going to determine why some people are stronger than others. Okay, what I'm going to show you here, I probably shouldn't, okay? Because I'm going to show you this and we're going to talk about it. And then I'm going to tell you at the end of this that while this is a thing that happens, it doesn't actually happen in normal human muscle under kind of normal conditions, okay? This is a thing that can go on with sarcomeres, but really it only goes on if we cut out individual muscle fibers and we stretch them to an extent that does not normally happen in you in a muscle that's in an intact human, okay? But it's kind of a very famous thing in muscle physiology, so I do want you to be aware of it, okay? What you are seeing here, okay, in this graph is something called the muscle length and force production relationship. And what it really is, this is really something called the sarcomere length tension relationship, okay? The sarcomere length tension relationship. And so what this is going to look like is, and these are data from a paper published in 1966. And so what you see here is they took an individual muscle fiber, probably from a rat or a mouse or something, and they dissected it down and all the way down to the level of the sarcomeres. And what you see here on the x-axis is what's called striation spacing. And so this is, if you think of a sarcomere that looks like this, where you've got actin and myosin overlapping, what they have done in the graph here is they've got normal sarcomere overlap, like normal. They've stretched the sarcomere way out, okay? And then they've also taken it and squished the sarcomere in on itself a whole bunch. And so the striation spacing is the distance that is between the thick and the thin filaments, or the overlap of the thick and the thin filaments. And so out here on the far right is a very stretched out sarcomere. Way over here on the left is a very shortened, smushed in on itself sarcomere. And then here in the middle is something kind of more in somewhere in between those things. And then the y-axis is force production, or tension in this instance. And it's tension expressed as a percentage of maximum because you get so little tension out of an individual sarcomere. So what you can see is that at very short sarcomere lengths, you get almost no force. At very long sarcomere lengths, you get almost no force. And then there is this kind of almost normal relationship in there where we're going to get this kind of normal distribution that as we get towards the middle, we're going to get more and more force up to some point, and then it begins to get stretched out and it goes down, or it begins to get very shortened and it goes down. Okay? So we call this short length, this is long length, and this area in the middle is termed the optimal sarcomere kind of overlap or optimal length. The reason that things look like this, and I've lost my cursor now, the reason that things look like this is based solely on the physical mechanical interactions of the thick and the thin filaments within the sarcomeres, okay? And so this is an accompanying drawing of the top part here. You've got thin filament, thick filament. This is showing what is happening at 3.65 micrometers of striation spacing. So this is way out here, okay? This is showing what is at basically 1 micrometer of spacing. So this is way down over here. And what you can see is that when we stretch the sarcomere way out, there is basically no overlap between the actin and the myosin. So the myosin cannot form cross bridges when it's really stretched out because there's no actin for it to bind to. It's been stretched out so far, nothing is there. At very short lengths, what has happened is the myosin has moved past itself so far that it is running into, the myosin is running into the Z disc down here on the ends, and it can't shorten anymore. And so there's no other place for it to go, so we can't get any more tension. And so then these other ones here are going to represent the stuff in the middle. So what we want to get the most force is we want to be in a place where all of the thick filament is going to overlap with a thin filament so that we have the capacity to form as many cross bridges as possible that's going to be in there. Okay, and so as we move from this optimal space either way out or way down, then we're going to get less force. Okay, does that make sense, guys? Yes, no, maybes, some kinds of nods of heads. Okay. So in isolated sarcomeres, this is real. This is actually a thing, okay? But in normal people, in normal muscle, and this probably will make sense to you, there is no ability for you to stretch your muscles out unless for some reason we like break a joint, okay? Or you're like super double jointed and you can't shorten it enough. You're very, 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 very rarely ever going to get out of this kind of optimal overlap situation with the sarcomeres in your muscles during a normal functional range of motion. Okay, so while experimentally this thing is real and it can happen and it does affect force production, it probably plays very little in changing the amount of force that we're going to see in your muscles. Okay. All right. Now I want to do this. Alex, are you in a place? Can you stand up for me?
Yes.
I want you to do a thing for us, but we need your camera on us.
Okay. Okay. Yep.
All right, everybody looking at Alex? All right. So, Alex, can you turn your camera down just a little bit? What I want you to do is, there you go. Guys, Alex, put your arms down with your elbows completely extended at your sides, okay? What I want you guys to do is, Alex, I want you to, if we have Alex do a curl, so Alex, do a curl motion for us with your right arm. There you go, perfect. Where in that curl motion is Alex going to be the weakest, and where is he going to be the strongest? Megan, what do you think? If he had to lift, we were doing a 1 rep max with him, and he had to lift a heavy weight. Where's he gonna get stuck?
Well, the easiest would definitely be near the end of the range of motion because gravity's not acting on the weight. But I know you're asking about like muscular wise. I'm guessing about halfway through ish.
Okay. About halfway through. Okay. So Alex, it's kind of dark. Your wall is very dark there. I can't see your. So you're kind of holding your arm at about halfway. That's okay. There we go. There we got some light. So he's right there. So you think that's where he's going to be the weakest, Megan?
Just an experience, like it's easier to get the weight moving a little bit, and then when you get like about halfway, it's like, oh crap.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. Good. Callie, do you agree or disagree?
Experience-wise, yeah, I would agree. But
Okay.
like, I don't know, when we're talking about this, I feel like at the bottom, like all the actin and myosin are farther apart, I guess. And so I'm thinking maybe it might be hard to generate that initial like cross bridge cycle. But
Okay.
then, like Megan said, when you're lifting weights, it's that middle part that's really hard. So
Okay. The middle part is really hard. Okay. Okay.
Very scientific right here.
Hey, that's okay. Pearson, do you wanna weigh in?
I kind of agree that it would be about in the middle because I mean, when you're doing a curl, once you get to the top, it's pretty easy to finish out the rep, it seems like,
Okay.
and then
Okay. Sure.
also just getting it going.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes you can move it a little bit, even if you can't get the full rep in.
Okay. No, that's a very reasonable thing. We will also gently chide Megan for saying that at the top that gravity is no longer acting on the barbell or the dumbbell, because its gravity is always there. I know what you mean, but that's okay. Jacob, you want to weigh in? I'm going to turn the air conditioner on here. I'm listening, so you guys just go ahead.
I mean, I get what everybody else is saying, but I guess in my head, I would think that it would be easiest at the middle length, but then harder at the other two spectrums.
Okay.
Just because when you're curling and you're holding your muscle like halfway, you're probably closer to like, how do I explain this? I think that you're probably like closer to being optimal rather than all the way short, because when you're up here, you no longer have anywhere to go because you have nowhere else to go. And then when you're all the way down, you're very stretched and there's not much overlap of myosin and actin, I suppose is how I would want to say it, for it to begin. But I think we also, like, they are taking into consideration gravity. So gravity plays a big effect on how much we perceive it to be heavy and how hard it is for us. But I would say if we were doing mechanic wise, I would think that being in the middle would be the easiest. And then starting it and ending it would technically be the less based idea of it, I guess. Like the harder portions.
No, that's a good way to think about those things. Alex, we've got you like standing up there. You're being our bicep model in those things. Do you want to weigh in?
I would agree with all of those statements. Just thinking about from any sort of movement pattern, just as everyone else is speaking from experience, I would say usually it's the midpoint that usually gets harder, unless it's like some sort of movement similar to a curl where the stretch reflex isn't involved at all.
Okay.
I think the beginning of the movement probably follow shortly after that.
Okay.
So nothing new to add really.
Okay, no, that's fine. You can sit back down if you would like to. So Keldon and Ryan, I've saved a different question for you guys in the midst of all of this. So we'll ask it this way. Keldon, as we were having Alex go through all of this, okay, at sort of full extension with his elbow locked out down, what do you think his sarcomeres are doing there versus what his sarcomeres are doing in the middle versus at the top? Like, do you think his sarcomeres at full extension look like this, where they're really stretched out, and all the way at full flexion, they're going to be here, and then somewhere in the middle is kind of looking like this?
Maybe towards the fully extended, maybe a little bit more towards it, but I think it's still right around probably like the 2.5. I wouldn't say necessarily closer to 3, but closer like 2.5, because it's still like what you said, it's not going to ever reach that point of lengthening, not unless it's a single sarcomere. So I think it'll always be in between, like right beyond optimal in the fully extended, and then right before optimal in the completely contracted.
Okay. So Keldon is, and you guys are in a weird way, okay? We're going to save our another question for Ryan here in a second, but in what may seem like a strange way, all of you guys are right, okay? You guys are right about and in general, I'm probably weaker out towards full extension and strongest somewhere in the middle, and maybe a little bit weaker up here at the top, and there's some other things that are kind of going on there, okay? You know, if you were going to get stuck doing a curl, you're probably going to get stuck somewhere about here. If you can make it to 90 degrees, then for the most part, you're probably going to be able to get that weight the rest of the way up, okay? I maybe should have done like Alex do a squat or something, it might have been a little more obvious that if you get down past 90 degrees, right, like you're definitely weakest, like way down deep in a squat, versus if you can get up to, I don't know, like if you can make it to like 60 degrees of flexion at your knee, then you're going to be able to get the rest of the way up. Okay. Yet also Keldon is right that we're not changing sarcomere length for the most part across this full. Out here, pretty much still optimal. Right here, pretty still optimal. Up here, also pretty optimal on my sarcomere lengths. So my question, Ryan, in all of this is, what the hell is going on? What is happening that, right, it looks like weaker, stronger, weaker, sure as hell looks like this. It looks like the length tension relationship, and yet we're actually not changing sarcomere length very much. So what's going on? You want to wager a guess?
Well, okay, so I was trying to think because this morning I actually did curls, and
Okay.
so I was like, and also a fun fact for bro science, I was thinking about it. My strength the past like 3 weeks, because I couldn't work out, has decreased drastically. But I realized that whenever like I was going up, like what you said, whenever I would go, like I could get to like halfway point if it was harder at the bottom, but when I got up, it was so much easier because I could follow through. I think it's all at like your actin and myosin are, it's like they're at the high tension because they're overlapping like a right amount, and so you can like continue through.
Okay.
But whenever you're like fully lengthed out, it's obviously a little bit more. I guess I'm like confusing myself a little bit.
That's okay.
Thoughts.
It's okay. This is sort of the critical thinking stuff that we have to kind of work our way through. And so you guys probably didn't take this in athlete tracking. Did any of you guys have biomechanics as undergrads? Anybody have biomechanics? No?
I did.
Jacob, they don't even teach biomechanics at K-State. They don't even have a biomechanist. So
Yeah, they do.
Do they? Oh, okay. Well,
I just didn't.
maybe it was just that Ade always was very, like, he scoffed at the biomechanists. The muscle guys, we don't love our biomechanists very much. Keldon, you had biomechanics. How many
Yeah.
of you have sat on a seesaw at some point in your life? Or you're at least aware of what a seesaw is?
Yeah.
Okay. So, do you guys realize that all of your joints are basically seesaws? Okay. So, Keldon, do you remember from biomechanics, as we do this, is there something that is changing? Is there another layer of complexity that we have not considered that might account for why our force production looks like this length tension curve, even though the sarcomeres are actually not changing length? And explain why Ryan can move it a little bit here, but then if she can get it up from there, she can make it the rest of the way when she was doing her curls.
It deals with the lever arm and
Yes.
the distance away from the fulcrum.
Correct. Okay. Technically inside, because it's an internal thing, we call it a moment arm rather than a lever arm, but it does not make the least bit of difference. The science behind it is exactly the same. Okay. So we have to be really careful about all of this because people get this wrong a bunch. A lot of undergraduate exercise physiology textbooks get this wrong and they conflate a couple of things. Okay. So the next layer of things that we have to talk about is what I'm going to call in vivo muscle length tension relationships. So in vivo essentially means in an intact organism, okay? Humans are organisms, so it could be in an intact human, it could be in an intact animal, whatever it is that you want it to be, okay? So what we observe, okay, I'm going to show you guys a little bit of data here, and then we're going to talk about kind of how we've arrived at all of this. What you guys see here is these are some data from Rick Lieber's lab at the University of San Diego. and Rick partners with an MD, and they measure stuff on people while they're under having like wrist surgery and knee surgeries and things, so that they can measure sarcomere length, they can open people up and measure actual moment arm length on the joints, and then like stimulate people and measure force production like while you're under. So it's this they get some really fascinating data from all of this. What you can see is there is a biomechanical, or it's a physics thing, and it's called torque, okay? For any of you that have had physics or you've had biomechanics, remember that there is linear movements and there are angular movements. And so force production in the sarcomeres is a linear movement. And so we call it force, okay? It's moving in a straight line. Well, all of our joints, for the most part, are going to produce what we would call angular movements. There's a rotational component to it around our joint. And so the force analog, when you talk about angular movements, is going to be, or a rotational movement, is something called torque, okay? And torque is equal to the force produced by the sarcomeres, or the force produced by your muscle, multiplied by the moment arm around which, at the joint, okay, about which our movement is occurring. All right. And so what you can see here is this is torque production and knee joint angle. Okay. And so we've got like 20 degrees of knee joint angle. And then we've got, this is all the way up to, I think that's 160 degrees of knee joint angle that we're going to see here. Okay. And so basically, I believe in their particular experiments, one of the things we would need to look at how they're actually defining. You got to be careful about how you're defining the range of motion at that particular joint, okay? But I'm pretty sure that what they are calling things is, this is going to be a very shortened knee extensor way out here, so very near out to like full extension, okay? And then this is going to be when they've got it cranked all the way back behind you. Sorry, again, old man thigh, like this, okay? Pulled back. Okay. And so what you will look at is that you can see again at what would be a very sort of shortened, we would perceive as a very shortened quad muscle, which you might think would have very shortened sarcomeres, a little bit less force. Somewhere in the middle here, kind of in that middle of your range of motion, nearer to 90 degrees of knee flexion, we're going to have kind of this more peak force, okay? And then as we pull it back down under, we're going to lose force like this, okay? What you can see here, this is going to be kind of actual sarcomere length, and so this is going to be their measuring differences in sarcomere length. You've got a very stretched sarcomere, you've got a very shortened sarcomere, and so what you guys can see from all of this, and the units are not great, but what you're getting is, this is, while it's changing, it's actually a very small amount of change in overlap. And then this thing in the middle, this is the change in the moment arm at the knee, okay? So this is what they're calling an effective lever arm. This is the distance at the knee, which I'm going to do it with my elbow, but say the tendon comes across and inserts on this side over here, and so we're measuring the distance from the tendon to the axis of rotation. And so the farther that distance is, right, the bigger the moment arm. Torque is force multiplied by moment arm. So bigger moment arm, bigger torque, okay? What we see in most human joints, like the knee and the elbow and things, is that at very extended joint angles, smaller moment arm, in the middle, bigger moment arm, and then at very flexed joint angles, smaller moment arm again. And so what we're actually able to get when we look at these in vivo relationships is force production due to some changes in sarcomere length and those things, but then that has to get multiplied out by the change in the moment arm. And so generally, you are strongest where your moment arm is going to be the biggest. And that tends to be in the middle portion of a range of motion. So at very extended and very flexed joint angles, you're weaker, and in the middle, you're a little bit stronger. Okay? And so that's why when you do a squat, once you get a little bit of the ways up, you can get past 90, you can make it to like 60 degrees, then you're going to make it the rest of the way because you've made it to where your moment arm is the biggest and you can lift. You're only as strong as your weakest point in your range of motion doing dynamic contractions. And so, you know, once you can kind of get over that point, then you're going to be okay. All right?
So the weakest would be at the bottom and the top.
Yes, the weakest would be at the bottom and the top. Mm-hmm. And what this tells us is that you are basically, because of the confluence of somewhat stretched sarcomeres and a small moment arm, you tend to be weaker at very, very stretched, okay, like very stretched angles than you do at very flexed kind of angles. So in a bicep curl, I'm probably going to be weaker at full extension than I am up here at full flexion, which probably makes sense to most people, okay? But because of the combination of we're a little bit stretched in our sarcomeres and we have a small moment arm, okay?
How did you say you determine moment arm again?
So, Callie, you measured the distance from the insertion of the tendon to the axis of rotation at the joint. And so in like the knee and the elbow and those things, people, if you're doing surgery and you have the joint laid open, you can physically measure it like with a ruler. But we can try to measure it with ultrasound, or we can try to measure it with like x-rays and MRIs and those kinds of things if we need to. And, you know, you just like hold it here and figure out where it is, and you measure the distance, and then we move it up here, but you have to kind of account for the change in where the moment arm is and the change in the axis of rotation. So it's kind of a little bit mechanically complicated, but that's how it's done. Okay. And if you really care about what those things are, there's some pretty good data from cadavers that people have that you can apply across different joints and things. All right. Any questions about that? Nope. Okay. So, all right. Now the next piece on all of this. Okay. So we've started moving. So we have this moment arm and things to consider. We've got our muscle size. We've got our ability to recruit things. There's another mechanical property of contractions that we also have to consider. And again, it's going to change force production because of how it is changing. So it's all about cross bridges. Bigger muscle, more cross bridges, more force. Higher recruitment and firing rates, more cross bridges for longer, more force, okay? Changes in moment arm, you're getting the same cross bridges, but it's the application of that force that's going to change things, right? If you change sarcomere length, then you may get a little bit less or a little more cross bridges. This one is going to be, you're forming the cross bridges, but then as we move, we have to break them, and so things are going to change. And so the next piece of this relationship is what we were going to call a force-velocity relationship, or the force-speed relationship, if you will. And so I'm going to show you this here, but I want you to appreciate that the axes are going to be flipped from what I'm going to show you in the next one, okay? The general take-home, okay, on the relationship between force production and contraction velocity is the faster your contractions occur, the lower the force, okay? And so what you can see here is, here we have velocity on the y-axis and force on the x. So at very high velocities, we have very low forces. At very low velocities, we have very high forces. At zero velocity, that's an isometric contraction. There's no movement, okay? Zero velocity is isometric. So in theory, an isometric contraction should produce a slightly higher amount of force than any kind of concentric contraction that we're going to perform. So if you're doing a curl again, you ought to be able to hold more weight stationary than you can ever actually pick up through a full range of motion, okay? That's not always the case based upon how we measure some things, but from a theoretical standpoint, that's how it should operate, Okay. So why does this happen? Why, when we go fast or we go faster, why is force going to decline? Okay. So again, it all ties back to the cross bridges. In order to generate force, we must have cross bridges engaged. Okay. So in order to actually move, okay, and shorten a muscle very, very quickly, we have to create the cross bridge, have the power stroke, disengage the cross bridge, okay, then re-engage, power stroke again, disengage, re-engage. We have to break the cross bridges apart and then reattach them in power stroke over and over and over again, very, very fast, okay? And so, again, this goes a little bit back to physics on some things. And so what we're going to look at then is that when you are doing a dynamic contraction, when there is movement, okay, at any given instant in time, at any given sort of instantaneous point, you have a certain number of cross bridges that are actively engaged in a muscle, generating force. And then you have a certain number that are in that transition step where they've broken off and are moving back to their high energy state so that they can reattach again. Okay? The faster that you are going, the faster we have to detach. The faster we have to detach at any instant, then there's going to be more of that population of cross bridges that are detached and moving back to high energy state than there are at a slower velocity. And that means when there's fewer that are any instant that are attached, you're going to generate less force. Okay? And so because we call this cross bridge cycling, because to go fast, you have to cycle very, very, very fast. At any moment in time, more of them are going to be detached and recycling than are going to actually be kind of hooked on. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Okay, you still have the same number of cross bridges. You still have the same capacity to recruit and to increase firing rate, and you still have the same sort of measured moment arms that are going on. And so those things all set some parameters on how much force you could get, and then we have to also then lay on top of that how fast you're trying to move. Okay, so having a bigger muscle and being better at recruiting is still going to allow you to generate more force at a fast velocity than somebody that has a smaller muscle and that is not as good at recruiting, okay? And so relative, those things are going to be the same, all right? But we also have to consider that to go fast, you're going to be able to generate less force, okay? So this in some ways explains what happens during concentric contractions, and it explains why isometric contractions in theory can generate more force than concentric contractions. Where things get weird, okay, where it gets weird, muscle phys after dark, where the weirdness sets in, and we all get weird, is during lengthening contractions, when you do eccentric contractions, okay? So I'm going to go away from this influence of task for a moment. We're going to come back to synchronization in a minute. We're going to talk about eccentric contractions really quickly as it relates to velocity, and then we'll go back and talk about a couple of other things. I apologize that those are in the wrong order, okay? What I'm showing you here, okay, is I was going to put my hand over a thing. I'm going to cover up this side of things, which you guys, of course, can't see. This here, this side right here in this graph, okay, this is the concentric portion of the force velocity curve. This is what you guys saw in the previous slide. But I want you to appreciate that the axes have been flipped so that now velocity is on the y-axis and torque production or force production is on the y. So here velocity, this is in radians per second. So degrees, so radians, it's like 2 pi radians are in 360 degrees. And so this is a fast velocity. Force production is lower at fast velocities. Here at this cross point where the line is in the middle, this is an isometric contraction, okay? And so we have slower, 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 force goes from very low up to something that's higher, okay? This line represents isometric, and then the left side of the graph over here is going to be velocity in a negative direction, okay? So we are going faster, but we're going in the opposite direction. So this side of the graph represents an eccentric muscle contraction, okay? So we've reached up here, and now we're lengthening out, going in the other direction. And we're going either slowly lengthening or fast lengthening. And so what I want you guys to look at is, and it doesn't matter, we're not going to concern ourselves with kind of how these data were collected. One of them is during a voluntary contraction, the other ones are during stimulated contractions. But what you can see is, look at this line here, okay? As I go faster and faster eccentrically, what happens to my force production?
Pretty much stays the same.
Force stays the same, okay? That's weird, right? When I go faster concentrically, force gets smaller, right? It decreases. So when you go faster eccentrically, the relationship is very different, okay? So going eccentrically, there's no real decline in force from increases in velocity. And if anything, when you go from isometric to kind of these very, very slow eccentrics to kind of moderate to then faster, we actually get a little bit of an increase in force as that happens, okay? So the force-velocity relationship is very much dependent upon the type of contraction that is being performed, okay? And again, it goes back to the cross-bridge mechanics. When I do a lengthening contraction, when I'm going to go down with my bicep, okay? Because force isn't getting smaller, we should assume that I'm not having to break and detach my cross bridges, which is indeed what happens. To do an eccentric contraction, you just engage the cross bridges, and then you engage just a tiny amount fewer cross bridges than you need to generate the proper amount of force to kind of hold that weight against gravity. And then they just hang on for dear life. It's like grabbing on, and you're just going to get dragged along as you just kind of slow down this thing and just don't let it fall, okay? Because you don't have to cycle them and detach them, you're never losing force. And that is why, because of that, we can go fast eccentrically and we get the same force. So we tend to say that eccentric contractions, their force production is independent of contraction velocity, okay? Independent of contraction velocity. And this has some interesting things to do with training and deceleration versus acceleration, and things like that, and why doing some eccentric stuff is actually going to generate higher forces and potentially cause more muscle damage and be higher stress than everything else. Okay, does that make sense? Ryan, are you frozen, or you got us? We're good? Okay. I couldn't tell. You were just sitting there. All right, good deal. All right, so now I'm going to back up. We're going to talk about the energy cost of eccentric contractions and their ability to produce force. And then we may talk about motor unit synchronization, and we'll probably call it a day for there today. All right, so I don't remember, Keldon and Callie and Ryan, when you guys had me as undergrads, if we had changed 3813, if we still had these data in there. But what you guys see in front of you is another very, 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 very famous kind of initial experiment in exercise physiology. It was performed out of Brenda Biglin-Ritchie's lab. This was published in 1952. But what you guys can see in this picture, and I swear that when we cleaned out a bunch of stuff in storage, we found one of these things. But you've got two bicycles that are facing opposite directions from each other, and they are both hooked up where the chain on the bicycle is connected. So both bikes are hooked onto the same chain. So when you pedal forward on one bike, the other bike is pedaling backwards, okay? And so what they had people do as part of this experiment was ride a bike pedaling at kind of increasing resistances going forwards, and then pedal the bike at the exact same resistance but going backwards, okay? And they measured their oxygen consumption. So they collected the air they were breathing out, and they're using oxygen consumption as a way to estimate energy expenditure during this bout of exercise, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about kind of what that means and how we do all of that a little bit later on, okay? But for everybody outside of Pearson, talking about oxygen consumption at least should make some sense to you guys, okay? So here our graph is set up in a lot of ways the same way the force velocity graph was, but we have increasing work in the positive direction. So riding a bike, pedaling forward, riding a bicycle is very much solely a concentric kind of knee extensor movement centered exercise, okay? And so what you can see then is if we have oxygen consumption on our y-axis, then as we go forward with increasing amounts of resistance or work, that we get this kind of very predictable linear increase in energy expenditure as we go forward, okay? When we go backwards though, you're doing the exact same amount of resistance. It's just in the opposite direction. What I want you to note is that as we increase, we do see some level of increase in energy expenditure, but it's much shallower. And here at like almost 1,500 kilometer minutes of work going backwards, you're at like a lower oxygen consumption than doing 300 or 400 or 500 going forward. So it's much, much less energy use to go at these very high force levels going backwards, right, than it is to go at even these low force levels going forward, okay? And so what they learned from all of this is that the energy cost of eccentric contractions is way less than it is of concentric contractions, okay? So at any given force level, any given weight that you're lifting, okay, you use much, much, much less energy to do that going sort of down than you do going up, all right? So we can sometimes illustrate this by asking you if I gave, I don't know, Ryan, what were you curling today, if you don't mind me asking? Like how much weight? Do you mind sharing?
I did hammer curls on the cable with 40.
With 40, okay.
20 each.
Okay, so if we had Ryan doing hammer curls, if we just had her do the up portion with, say, her 40, all right, how many of those did you go to failure today? Like how many of those could you do?
I did 12 reps for 4 sets.
12 reps, okay. So doing 12 reps going up, if we had pulled the cable for her and given it to her up here and then just had her then lower that same weight down, she probably could have done, I don't know, 30 or 40 or 50 reps going down without ever getting kind of fatigued and tired, okay? Because the energy cost at that force production level doing it eccentrically is way, way less, okay, than it is going up. And if it costs less energy, it's likely going to be less fatiguing, okay? The other fun part of this experiment, and you know, I like to think of these things as it was 1950 or so when this was done. They wouldn't let women run in the marathon because, as I told you guys, they were afraid, ladies, that your uterus was going to fall out. You know, in the midst of this was they would put these big, strong bros and have them pedal forwards, and then put these little, small, petite ladies and have them pedal backwards. And the women could stop the guys from going forward on the bike very, very easily. And so you have these, you know, big, strong, burly, you know, 1950s, you know, men that have returned from World War II, you know, kind of guys. And then you've got their little petite wives going the opposite direction, and the men can't move them. in that way. So we're striking an early blow to the patriarchy here in the midst of all of this. And we could have also then taken and put the women going forward and put like my daughter on the other end, like the 2-year-olds on the other end, and they could probably stop, the kids could stop the adult women from going forward because we are much, much stronger. Maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30% stronger doing eccentric contractions than we are doing concentric or isometric contractions, okay? If it's the difference between a fast eccentric contraction and a fast concentric, it may be 100 or 150% stronger going eccentrically than we are going concentrically, okay? So eccentric contractions are very, very unique, okay? They don't cost us any energy because we don't cycle the cross bridges very often. Because we don't cycle the cross bridges and they never break, we can get more force, okay, than we can going concentrically. Because when you do an eccentric contraction, assuming you recruit all of your muscle eccentrically, all your cross bridges grab on and they just hang on. You're trying to do a maximal concentric, even if it's very slow, they all engage, but then some of them have to kind of pop off. And so you can get more force eccentrically. And so this creates some kind of unique scenarios whereby when you run downhill at the same speed as running uphill or on level ground, it's not as metabolically taxing. That's why running downhill feels easier, because it's easier, right? It costs you less energy to go downhill than uphill. Because it costs less energy, then the cardiovascular response is lessened. Because the cardiovascular and then the metabolic response is lessened, then your CO2 response is less, so breathing is less. So all of these things, simply because of cross bridges, you're going to get lessened physiological stressors. And that's why going downhill feels easier than going on level ground. That's why going uphill at some speed feels even more difficult than that same speed on level ground, because you're having to cycle, to go at that same speed, you got to generate more force, so you have to engage more muscle. You're going to have to cycle more cross bridges. Okay? Does all of that make sense, guys? Because if we don't understand this, then the last couple of things and our ability at the end of class to understand why certain things determine performance, why we train in certain ways based upon what a particular event asks us to be able to do, it's not going to make a lot of sense, okay? But again, all of this, for the most part, ties itself back into actin and myosin interacting together and that cross-bridge cycle. Where is the energy used in a contraction? Where is the force generated in a contraction? And how do those two things change based upon, is it concentric? Is it isometric, right? Is it very fast concentric? Is it very fast eccentric, all right? You guys with me? So what we should do, okay, everybody, and, I'm not encouraging this. I'm not saying that we need to go to the gym, but the next time, ladies, and unfortunately, and maybe I don't know, maybe Alex has happened, maybe Kelvin's happens to you guys in the gym too, but the next time you're in the gym and somebody wants to come over and, tell you what to do or something, right? I don't know. Ladies, if this has ever happened to y'all, some bro wants to come over and try to give you pointers on your squat technique or whatever it is, challenge them to do something where you do an eccentric contraction and you lift more weight than them eccentrically than concentric, or you do more reps eccentrically than they do concentrically, and then tell them to basically go and fuck off and that you know what you're doing and they need to leave you alone. When you want their help, you'll ask for it. Or something in that particular way. Maybe that happens, maybe in some instances, right? There are instances where the girls will go over and tell a guy that he's got really bad squat form in the midst of all of that. But my sense is that it probably mostly happens with dudes trying to say things to the ladies in the midst of all of that, because I don't really know what it is in our sort of brains in our society where we need to go mansplain a squat to people in the midst of that. So anyway, okay. All right, with our last couple of minutes here, I want to explain one more thing, and then we'll call this a day. Okay. So this is back to a nervous system issue. This is an issue of recruitment and firing rate. Okay. And so remember from the graph for a monster that was my favorite graph ever, that what we can see is that you're going to have multiple motor units recruited at the same time, and they may each be at a slightly different firing rate. Okay. Well, there's another phenomena that happens, and it's called synchronization. And it has to do with the pattern of when action potentials in one motor neuron are occurring in time with action potentials that are occurring with other motor neurons in that same muscle. Okay. And so again, it's kind of been summer. So anybody like maybe anybody ever been like in the water? Maybe you've been in a hot tub lately. You know what? Don't answer that question. I don't want to know. Maybe you've taken a bath. I end up taking lots of baths because Ellis gets dirty every day. So we have bath time like almost every day. So when I'm in the bath with Ellis, she likes to splash the water around and things. But one of the things that happens, and it's especially noticeable when like with the movement of fluids, is if you push the water going in one direction, it goes, and then it will like rebound off, and it comes back like off the end of the bathtub back towards you, and you can either then like send a wave in the opposite direction, and if it hits it, then those two things will either add up together and you'll get one really big wave, or if it catches it right, it will essentially cancel out the wave coming back the other direction. Okay, so this is going to get at the idea of synchronization of these motor units. And so if you have what we would call very synchronous firing of motor units, it looks like this. So here is we're looking at the signals from one motor unit and then a second motor unit, okay? And in synchronous firing, when you get these action potentials going boom, 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 boom in one motor unit, when it's very synchronous, the second motor unit or the third or the fourth or whatever, it is going to have their action potentials are going to occur time-wise almost simultaneously with the firings in your other motor units. Okay, so they're very synchronous. They're all firing like kind of right in lockstep with each other. Conversely, very asynchronous firing, when you get an action potential in one motor unit, there's no action potential in the other ones. They're kind of at this kind of, they're not time locked, while one is not firing, the other one is. And so one of the things that happens when you get very synchronous firing is that you get this rhythmic increase in force production out of the muscle. So one of the ways that we can actually learn to get more force out of a muscle is to fire all of the motor units in that muscle where their action potentials stack up like right on top of each other. So it's very, very synchronous. The problem is it functions where the force comes in waves, like you're generating waves in the bathtub. Okay, so when the action potentials come, it gets turned on and you get this big wave, and then when they're off, then the force dips back down. So it's this kind of, it goes whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. My, sound effects by me, but the force is gonna kind of fluctuate up and down. And so you get big changes in strength. Okay, this can be really good for like a one-off effort, right? Ryan's going to max out her curl today, and she's got to get as much as she can for this one deal. Or Megan is going to do, I don't know, like a long jump or something today, and you got to get that max force from one single effort, right? So being very, very synchronous is going to give you a little bit more force out of all of those motor units from the same firing rate, just because you're lining them up together. Okay? If we get very asynchronous firing, though, the problem with synchronous is the force fluctuates. You get a bunch, and then you get a little, and you get a bunch again, and you get a little. So it's good for one-offs, but it's not good for sustained things because you become very unsteady, okay? Asynchronous firing is good for activities that require very, very steady, precisely controlled amounts of force. Writing, okay? Playing a musical instrument, okay? Like the violin or the cello or something like that, where you have all of these really fine controlled movements from your hands. In that instance, asynchronous firing is really good because you get more motor control out of asynchronous firing, and you can very precisely, you do not get the fluctuations in force, okay? And so the reason that I bring all of this up, and this was again supposed to be the idea that the task that you are trying to undertake is going to play some role in the strategy that the nervous system takes to turn on a muscle, okay? If you're doing some kind of thing that requires very high force, then the nervous system will try to fire very synchronously, and we can train it to do this, okay? You can train yourself to fire synchronously in certain instances. If you're doing things that require motor control and very little force fluctuations, you can actually train the nervous system to fire very asynchronously. And so they've got some fascinating data from people that are, you know, like elite level orchestra players, like people that play the cello or the violin or stuff, and they're so asynchronous that it's just wild. And then if you take people that are like power lifters or people that do a lot of like single jumps and those kinds of things, and you look at them, they're much better at firing very, very synchronously. And so we can kind of change and we can do some of these things. But again, we need to be able to measure with either fine wire stuff or the somewhat unreliable surface things that we have in my lab, where you can measure the individual action potentials going to the muscles to figure out, are you synchronous, are you asynchronous? And so don't worry about what's happening down here in the bottom two graphs. This is just some methodological things about if we are able to measure these things, how we would go about calculating if you have very synchronous or very asynchronous firing or not. Because what you do is you compare every motor unit to all the other motor units, and you calculate this distance from one action potential in one motor unit to the action potential in the next, and then you graph them all together and you make a histogram. And if it's very synchronous, where they all occur with very little time between them, you get these peaks around this time lock of 0 because there's very little difference. It looks like this. If it's very asynchronous, then it's basically going to be like flat across all of this. This is just kind of showing how we can calculate these things, which doesn't really matter that much. But I just want you guys to appreciate again that there's all of these very complex things that go into determining how much force you can generate, and also the strategies at different velocities and at different tasks that the nervous system is going to employ at how it wants to achieve reaching the force that your muscles can actually generate. Okay. All right. Questions, comments, concerns? No? Okay. If you want to know more about all of this, then although it would be 2 years, I think 2 springs, then wait and take, I think I taught it a couple of years ago, but Dr. Pereira taught it last year. Wait and take the doctoral neuromuscular physiology class, and you can learn all about all of this. And you might even be able to see us. We can collect data and actually try to show you how we calculate these things. But anyway, it's a different thing for a different day. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going